Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching the Weaviate Podcast. I'm super excited to host Atai Barkai, co-founder of TawkitAI, which has created PodcastGPT. Personally for me, the kind of dog fooding of using this Weaviate podcast, the transcriptions that I get from Whisper and putting that into Weaviate and using that to prototype these retrieval augmented generation, LLM, Vector Database apps. It's been so much fun for me. So I'm, so excited for this conversation. I love diving into what we can do with podcasts, kind of the future of podcasting with large language models, and generally how, I love like hearing like-minded people who are curious about this kind of application. So firstly, Atai, thank you so much for joining the Weaviate podcast.
Glad to be here, Connor. And yeah, I checked out your Weaviate Podcast GitHub, and it's very cool. Yeah, it's a great thing to dog food.
Thank you. That means the world to me. I mean, it may be first before diving into the GitHub and maybe telling you a bit about some of the projects that I've done, sort of lessons learned. Let me if you could tell us about how you see the space and what motivated you to get into this.
Yeah. So TawkitAI is building an LLM native audio-video database. So kind of a layer in between vector databases and relational databases and the individual file analysis. So transcription, diarization, all that stuff. And our kind of breakthrough product is a consumer product. We kind of have our own design partner for the database component. It's called PodcastGPT.ai, which just launched in alpha about a month ago. And it's basically, have AI listen to all your podcasts, find the most interesting parts for you, and then send those to any podcast app. So obviously, yeah, the big thing that shifted with language models is the computer can actually understand what people are talking about, right? It's no longer just keywords. And that just opens the possibility to do search, to do semantic search, not keyword search, but you're looking for type of content or content about something, and you can actually find it, and you can know how high quality is it, how relevant, how interesting, so how relevant to your other interests. So there's a lot you can do now that wasn't possible before.
Yeah, amazing. And yeah, I think that's perfectly it. Is kind of what I'm, hoping we can hash out in this conversation is, further exploring what's possible now that wasn't possible before. When I came across Podcast GPT and reached out to you because I was really curious to talk to you, one thing was, this kind of like interactive experience, like chat with podcasts, that chat with your data, chat with PDFs, chat with podcasts. Like, can you tell me how you see that kind of like interactive experience with podcast listening?
Yeah, so actually, it's interesting because the consumer product, consumers don't care about the technology; they care about the experience. And podcasting is a very interesting medium because, so first of all, I don't know if you know this, worldwide there's roughly 2 billion hours of podcast listening per month, which is a lot, right? There's only 8 billion people on the planet. Um, and it's very different kind of consumption from what people do on TikTok or Twitter. It's long form. Roughly every session is on average 23 minutes long, which makes sense to all of us, right? While you commute, while you run. So people really kind of want to start pressing something and then not worry about it. So the interactive component is very, very interesting in outside of podcast consumption, right? To build tools for podcasters to build maybe like just a plain search engine. But when you think about just plain podcast consumption, you actually want to go as far away from possible from interactivity. And actually, the direction we took this to is we don't even have our own app. We actually did start having our own app, but what we figured out is really kind of the intelligence is the product here, and there's no reason to try to move people over from their habit, right? People have habits formed over years. They use this app, the podcast app, for years. What's the minimum way that we can augment that experience without asking the user for anything? So the basically kind of the interface we came up with is all of podcasts are built on top of this open protocol called RSS. And yeah, not many people know this, but even Apple and Spotify, they don't actually host the content or anything. They just, you tell them, here's where my podcast lives, and then they kind of redisplay it. So we can put up our own podcast for you that looks the same to that podcast application. It's just one more RSS feed, except the contents inside of it can now be essentially clips, but long form clips, right? Not 2 minutes, but 15 minutes, 20 minutes,
Mm-hmm.
from maybe what was a 3 hour long episode, and we can deliver that to you right away, and also tell you what's inside of that clip, why you should watch that clip, right? So it's very specific. Um, so yeah, that's how we think about this from the perspective of plain consumer product for
Mm-hmm.
podcast consumption. But of course, when you start to think about tools for podcasters, which is I think one of the obvious applications of having audio video database, then the interactivity starts to become a lot more important. Um, and then on our side, the interactivity is mostly on the backend side, right? We kind of figure out, okay, what are your interests, based on what you tell us right now. Actually, we're going to add Twitter crawling soon, so you can just see what
Mm-hmm.
your interests are, and then surface things that are really kind of hyper targeted for you in this long form world.
Yeah, wow. A lot of really interesting ideas in there. I love the kind of, I guess, kind of the first one of the earlier things you were describing is that kind of syncing up of the clip recommendation, clip extraction, kind of with Apple Podcasts, with Spotify, and how you can unify these interfaces. I do think that's a really powerful topic. Like, with Weaviate, like sometimes when I think about this Weaviate podcast and that kind of demo project, I think about like maybe integrating this on the Weaviate.io website. So like, and I build my clip kind of recommendation, but I do think what you're describing is probably the more likely future for this, that kind of personalization is managed by some kind of platform, almost like Substack, how you have like an email list. But I think kind of just generally, it's like the evolution of these email lists, they become more like a CRM for you, where it like keeps
Right.
information about why particularly you would want to watch this podcast clip. And I think, yeah, if we could maybe stay on that like hyper personalization of podcast recommendation, yeah, I think like just kind of like using the language models to take the podcast clip, take some biography from a person, or even, yeah, I loved what you said about the Twitter. That kind of like data connection is a super powerful thing. So yeah, maybe if you could just tell me a little more about how you see like personalizing it, how exactly is that completely new with the language models and all this.
Yeah, yeah. So, I mean, really, before you even can get to personalization, if you think about the intelligence kind of pyramid, that's kind of the personalization is the very tip of the pyramid, and
Mm.
there's a lot of work you have to do beforehand. So, obviously, like the first steps is transcription, getting the what the words that
Mm.
are being said, and diarization, which not as many people know this term, but it's who said what, right? So it's not just these words were said, but this person said that. I'm saying these words, you're going to say words later. So that's kind of your basic fundamental building block. But then
Mhm.
that really interesting part, and by the way, that and there's been massive advancements in the last year. OpenAI's Whisper and Whisper 2 are just kind of it's open source, it's free, you can run it on your own GPUs, and it's kind of significantly better than anything that existed up until that point. Now there's even more competition, which is great, but like we're really starting to get to the very very tip. Like transcription is almost solved, not quite. There's still um, niches that need to be solved, and obviously it's not necessarily 100% perfect, but overall you get very good quality. Um, diarization is still not quite at the same level, but you can get very very close to perfection, especially with the aid of kind of a language model to sanity check. Like, does it make sense that all of a sudden this sentence was said by somebody else? Like, maybe not. Okay, so
Yeah.
we can kind of use the intelligence there to straighten that out. So, but once you have this diarized transcript, the really interesting part is coming up with a hierarchy of segments. Because you have essentially, if you think about a podcast, especially, right? Because these things tend to be pretty long. Um, you have, maybe a 30-minute segment that is kind of an arch, right? That, or an arc that gets covered. And then inside of it, there might be about 5 minute and 7 minute and 8 minutes that kind of are even more pointed to a specific direction. So
Mm.
you want to be able to find this hierarchy of segments, And that is really, it's a very interesting problem. It's not trivial.
Mm.
You can kind of do it in a recursive way. A lot of the techniques that work to find the small segments, if you kind of zoom out, you can use them to find the bigger segments. So, uh, so that's really interesting. And over there, there's actually in our experience, what tends to work best has to do with embeddings. So kind of a good entry point to the vector database, and we can talk about that. But then once you've gotten all of this stuff, so now we have a coherent segment that is 25 minutes long. Now you got to match the segment with a person. And right, so like if there's a 3 hour long podcast, maybe I'm really into my background before tech is physics, right? So if somebody's talking about interpretations of quantum mechanics, that's really
Mm.
interesting to me. Maybe it's not very interesting to you. So how do I map this segment to me, and to you maybe a segment about I don't know, something else that you're
Yeah.
into, and there it's a very interesting problem. I think it's an open problem. I think we're going to see a lot of advancements in that realm. The most trivial thing you can do, again, has to do with embeddings, right? Like what type of things belong in your cluster of things, um, and obviously just traditional ranking, personalized ranking, like you see. But I think what's really interesting with language models is that this type of ranking can actually now rely on the content, on what's
Mm.
inside of the content, rather than kind of proxies of user interest, like who's clicking what. And if you think about what news feeds look like a lot of the times nowadays, you can tell they're really optimizing for the clicks, but it's both a conscious kind of choice maybe, but also they really don't have much better to do. Like, how are you going to know if this video is good or not if you don't know what's inside of it? You kind of have to rely on clicks. But if you can now look inside of the content, that gives you a whole new dimension to rate content by, which is especially important for long form content, where people, you know, they really want to be engaged for the duration
Hmm.
of their drive, their walk. It's not good enough to clickbait them. Yep.
Yeah, firstly, I'm glad sometimes when I take notes when I'm doing a podcast, I only have one piece of paper, but I just did like half of my paper on what you just said. So
Oh
I'm
my
glad I
god.
have more than one paper,
Podcast.
but it was really great. I kind of beginning with that diarization and Whisper, having that integrated in the same platform that then does the LLM personalization. I believe strongly in that. Right now I have like a collab notebook that my Whisper goes into personally. I'm also kind of not necessarily working on this all the time, but I've kind of given up on diarization because, for me, it's like labeling. Whisper doesn't give you the diarization, and I haven't. Maybe someone wants a link to it and it'll just solve my problem right away. But like, I've just decided to just chunk the text, as you mentioned. Like the LLM can sanity check. Like, does it make sense for this? That actually I think works pretty well. And that
Interesting.
scale, yeah, and that scale is nicer for me to just get all of these podcasts in there quickly. And yeah, so I believe strongly with that. My other thing, kind of with a platform that does this, is like for me, my Whisper will translate like Weaviate to WV8,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
these,
yeah.
yeah. And so these kind of things are like kind of a problem for then, like an embedding that is like, like, yeah, I can imagine these little transcription errors are kind of problematic for these information specific podcasts. Like our podcast particularly is going to be about like, we usually really dive into it on vector databases. And so it's like, those little transcription errors. But so then talking about kind of personalization again is this kind of like, I love this separation, as you mentioned, like the popularity bias being too strong. In Weaviate, we have this thing called ref to vec, where it's like, this is like one of the demos in that GitHub repository too, where it's like Connor, and then I interact with like 4 podcast clips. And this is something like that, was just going viral on Twitter, is somebody discovering this, that averaging these embeddings actually like produces a pretty nice vector in the middle of it. I
Yeah,
was so surprised when I started playing with this, but just averaging those 4 clips, the embedding of those 4 clips I liked, just using that then as the search vector.
yeah,
And then, yeah, that kind of ranking stuff, we just did like an integration with Cohere's re-ranking models, and that takes as input like the query in the document, and replacing the query with like a user biography. And so maybe
yeah,
first search, yeah,
yeah.
first. Yeah, I think all that's so powerful. But kind of the this is my notes that I'm replaying. But the one thing that you said that I really want to get more thoughts on is that hierarchy of segments. I've never heard that before, so that like light bulb moment. And I've been playing with summarization chains. It's like this idea where it's like the prompt is like you will receive the clips one by one as well as the local summary so far or the local list of chapters so far, and you just but that kind of idea of maybe having like a topic modeling where you have the latent space, the embeddings of all the clips, and then you cluster those clips, and then you have like hierarchical topic modeling.
Yeah.
Can you just tell me more about how you see that perspective of hierarchy of segments? I think there's definitely something to that.
Yeah, yeah. So I mean, I think it's really interesting. For like, it's well, first actually, I mean, it's all kind of related. And I would also love to hear. We could do this later. Your diarization take, because that's interesting for us. Actually, diarization, which surprised me, significantly boosted performance of the rest of the chain.
Hmm.
And I suppose it might be I didn't try to do just LLM guess diarization. Maybe that would have been good enough. Um, but if you just compare it to the plain transcript, it really made a big difference to the rest of the chain. And you can kind of see it yourself if you yourself just look at a transcript with diarization and without. It's much easier to understand what's actually happening with this little piece of information. But on the hierarchy of segments, um, so what's interesting actually with ref to vector, I don't know if you saw Yohei, like of baby AGI fame, like he posted a tweet that is an averaging of all the embeddings of his tweets and then back to text, and it's really
Hmm.
interesting to see what the result of that was. And what you can tell is that the kind of highest order bit is style to some extent. It looks like a tweet,
Mm.
right? You cannot mistake that text that came out for something other than a tweet. It's a tweet by a techie, right? It's like kind of like so. So that's the first kind of highest order bit to some extent that gets maintained there. Um, so the way we think about transcription, and honestly, sorry, not transcription, but segmentation, is you're trying to find the flow of topics, right?
Hmm.
The thing that represents a flow of topics the best is an embedding, but you want uh, you want to kind of lose the stylistic parts when you try to figure out the flow of topics. So the first thing we do before we look at embeddings is we kind of normalize the segments that we're looking at to be of a uniform style to some extent. So we say, okay, let's summarize what's happening in this clip from kind of this third person perspective. So, hey, this person talked about this, they brought that up, like rather than just have the plain embedding of what was said directly. Um, and what we found is that when you do that, then when you look at embedding distances, that tells you when actually topics have shifted. So
Mm.
a strategy that we use is we basically embed. We take all these segments, we chunk them up, we normalize them, we embed the normalized text, and then we compare the embedding distance between a chunk and the preceding chunk.
Mhm.
Um, and we actually do this for the two previous predecessors, right? So you see, okay, like if you have all this array of segments, essentially, um, you look how essentially you're asking how different is this segment from the segment right before it and from the segment right the previous before and before, right? And then what you see is when you find when you look at all of these for the entire podcast, the spikes in embedding
Mhm.
distance correspond to topic changes, to essentially segmentations, and you can do this when you do this with segments that represent very short segments, then you get the shorter segments. But you can repeat the same exact process with a longer segments, right? So let's say now you found, okay, here is one short segment. Now let's take which consisted of a lot of these kind of micro segments, right? So now let's take this, we summarize this, we normalize that, and you can repeat the same process again, and now you see, okay, these four segments that are each 5 minutes long, they make a coherent segment that is 25 minutes long, because there's this arc change that happens
Hmm.
at the end of that. I don't know if that made sense. It's kind of a
Oh, yeah, that sounds. I mean, I think kind of firstly that kind of like normalized the style by making it like kind of. I read this one paper that's called like retrieving texts based on abstract descriptions, and so you take like a podcast clip and you prompt the language model to like just make it the content, normalize the style. Yeah, that's a really interesting kind of thing. And as you mentioned, just looking at the embedding distance to detect topic change, that could be a huge cost saver compared to having the language model go through it. And yeah, obviously I love any kind of application of embeddings with
yeah.
Weaviate. But like yeah, really my curiosity as we were talking is going into this like multi-discourse topic. This is like you are trying to embed a chunk of text that talks about multiple things. Like I think kind of as Atai kicked off this podcast, we had a lot of speaker turns that mentioned multiple things. Like it would be like, whisper diarization, ref to vec, and ranking, like all in the
Mhm.
same kind of clip. And so what kind of happens with embeddings is like an embedding for just that, multi topic thing doesn't really work all that well. So yeah, what you're saying, I'm trying to come up with a good question to follow up with it, but that kind of like, separating out the topics, I think that is definitely a powerful thing for just probably like text chunking in general. Probably for anyone building any kind of application with vector databases, they should be thinking about something to do with that. I mean, maybe, yeah, I don't know. I mean, and then I really like what you're saying about how you would try to then tie all the topics that you decompose into one big coherent thing. Yeah, this is kind of my first time hearing this, so I'm sorry if I'm not like quick enough to come up with like a good
Yeah, no, no.
reflection to it, but that kind of
Yeah, it's obviously this is use case dependent, but for podcasts where it's people speaking, right? It's not, a lot of text that is natively text is kind of by default very structured. If you look at
Mhm.
archive documents, they all kind of look the same, they have the same style. So you can kind of get away without doing any type of normalization because it's already normalized by whoever wrote the thing in the first place.
Mhm.
But when you look at just conversation, free flowing conversation, um, then yeah, if the example you said initially, we started talking about, okay, Weaviate and Lambda Index and all these things. If we just look at the embeddings for that, that will now connect to some other time that we said Lambda Index very strongly. But if you first summarize this, then the summary would be, well, Atai and Connor discussed at a high level, like a few LLM technologies, including
Mhm.
Weaviate and Lametics and so on and so forth. So now that's a very different thing to embed, um,
Mhm.
because now it connects to summarization, right? So maybe we also in the beginning of the podcast we discussed at a high level some other things, right? We also discussed at a high level what TawkitAI does. So now these two things connect, whereas maybe they wouldn't have before we normalized it. So for me, for kind of free form content, the step of embedding is almost necessarily tied to some type of normalization by the language model to begin with. In order, again, if you talk about kind of a longer chunk of content that you're trying to relate to other long chunks of content.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think that's absolutely brilliant. That's the first time I've been studying this problem of like domain generalization in deep learning. Like you train an image classifier on clip art and it can't generalize to photorealistic images or sketches, like understanding the confounding impact of style on deep learning models. And yeah, this just really helped it click for me. I mean, I love that summary index, the idea that you use the LLMs to summarize something and then the embedding of the summary ends up creating better search. Yeah, so I thought that was really a really interesting conversation topic. Let's if we could pivot, I love also talking about how can we make podcasting more interactive, kind of that long form, make it more interactive. I'm curious what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, it's a tough one, honestly. So we actually got to this world in a very convoluted way. We started just with podcasts, not with AI, actually more kind of social um,
Mm,
podcasting, uh, and there's a bunch of companies that started out around the same time. and basically none of them made it. And it's because like there's something when you start to like really look at podcast, this world of podcasting. I mean, what works really well in this world is obviously tons of consumption, right? 2 billion hours a month, that's a lot. Um,
Mhm.
a lot of by a lot of people, right? So it's pretty universal in the U.S. Something like a third of adults listen to our weekly podcast listeners. They listen on average to 2 to 3 hours a week. So that's
Mm.
quite a lot. Like it's pretty varied also.
Mhm.
The thing that is broken is distribution, right? So people generally have um, 4 to 5 podcasts they kind of keep track of,
Mhm.
and then it's all or nothing consumption. Anything that's outside of these 4 or 5 podcasts, it will never even get the chance to enter their sphere. And if you, and it's also all or nothing at the level of the episode, because you have this, 2 3 hour long episodes oftentimes, and unless you listen to the whole thing, you will never hear the 30 minutes in the middle. Um,
Mm.
and that's just really hard to solve, because again, it's a multitasking medium, right? In its native form, like these 2 billion hours of consumption, people consume podcasts in other places too, right? On TikTok, that's a lot. There's a lot of
Mhm.
clips from podcasts that go viral, but that's a very different mode of consuming this content, which is also important,
Mhm.
um, for spread, especially. But if you look at just plain podcast consumption, it's generally a multitasking medium. So people consume it while they're walking their dog, while they're exercising, while they're commuting. Um, and interactivity is really hard there because you're, screen off. It's kind of like a screen off medium.
Mm.
Um, which is why it can be long form. And by the way, that's in itself pretty interesting, because every other medium in our lives is pulling to shorter and shorter and shorter, right? Like, so
Mm.
YouTube videos went to TikToks, right? So
Yeah.
from like 10 minutes long to now a minute long, right? That's kind of the average. Text went from blog posts to tweets, right?
Mhm.
So most media kind of pull to short form, but podcast, because it's a multitasking thing, if you imagine in your mind walking and listening to 1 minute, 1 minute, 1 minute, like that sounds like hell. Um, so it's like the long form is what works, and then that kind of comes hand in hand with not as much interactivity. So the question is, when you want to add interactivity, what where are the entry points that you can do that easily, or that correspond to user habits and user preferences? um, and I think so there's like a few places that, I mean, first of all, like, just podcast is just a wealth of knowledge that is really fascinating, that in a form that is really easy to consume. So better integration with search. You search for something on Google, you find text. Probably there's some 5 minute clip from a podcast, if depending on your topic, that will be like much much better for you to like get than um
Mm.
than a blog post that's talking about it. But you'll get the blog post, you won't get this 5 minute segment. So that's one place to add interactivity. And then on the consumption side, there's a lot of things uh too we can talk about, but maybe I'll pause it there. So
No, I think, yeah, I love everything you said about kind of how you consume podcasts. Like for me, I think that 2 to 3 hours is probably about accurate. And just like for me personally, I'm sure it's
yeah.
accurate for everyone, but like, I usually am kind of tired from work or coding and something. So it's more like I'm, yeah, walking around or like playing a video game, and that's more the experience. And so when I think about that kind of like clip recommendation thing, I think maybe one way it could work is like you listen to Connor and Atai talking about this, and then maybe there's some LLM with a voice narrator that says like, and now here's a clip from Machine Learning Street Talk where they also talk about this topic. And maybe that's one way to build the experience, where you have some like intermediate narrator that's really like an LLM with a voice clip thing. But, something that you ended the conversation with, your speaking turn as a do the podcast, think about it like transcriptions, but
Yeah.
this like the information value of podcast clips, like you mentioned, whether you Google search for a topic, whether you would want to be brought to a Medium article, a YouTube video, an archive paper, or a podcast clip. And I think the podcast clip like it adds the, it's kind of like when you're I don't know, maybe like a spelling bee when you're like, could you use it in a sentence? I don't know why that would help you spell it better, but like if the task instead of spelling it was like, what's the meaning of it, right? Like I feel like that kind of like conversational context of something like, like one of my favorite projects is building this like, llama index has this like query router across different indexes. So I have the blog posts, the podcast transcriptions, and then I have the Weaviate code base. And so I feel like if you're talking about like what is ref2vec, it's definitely cleaner in the blog post or the code documentation, but there's something to that, like how's it used in conversation, kind of right? Like it's kind of like it has like a unique information value to it. And that kind of brings me the question that I wanted to ask about is it's like these podcasts, it's almost like a sport. Like you and I are right now, like think about like what are we going to say next? How am I going to react to what Atai is going to say? And so to me, it's kind of like this like post game analysis almost. I love like the interview study kind of papers. I think like that is also something powerful. That's like how do you go from like a podcast into kind of a blog or something that's more curated and more like a reflection of these things.
Yeah. Sorry, can you say that like just the last part again? So the like how
Yeah,
do you
like
go?
sometimes, like just as an anecdote, I remember when I started the Weaviate podcast and I had this conversation with Han Zhao, the CEO of Gina AI, and he like just gave me this massive tour of neural search, and I was like, this should be like a survey paper. There were like this should be like an academic survey paper. There was so much to it. So like, I feel like there even like our conversation now is like, how do we go from like all these topics we talk about, kind of like transcribing it, and then I feel like also kind of turning it into the written artifact as well could be an opportunity for this stuff.
Yeah, yeah, no, for sure. It's there's definitely, if you look at the content that is kind of right now hidden inside of audio and video,
Mm-hmm.
and it is hidden, right? Because for the most part, these are opaque files that live in a hard drive somewhere, and
Yeah.
uh, when they do get surfaced for you, it's very non-granular. They kind of,
Mm.
here's a video that is relevant for this, but okay, it's an hour long. Where right? Um, and Yeah, so I think there's a lot of interesting things of just putting this in
Mm.
a plain textual form, and it seems like it's getting closer and closer to actual reality. Um, and then on the other side, it's also very interesting to kind of there's this trend that's happening outside of podcasts of personalization of content, right? Like the there's this South Park episode that went viral that got generated by the LLM. So people, you can have a South Park episode generated just for you that nobody else watches. Like, I think
Mm.
things will probably start to get more and more to that place. Probably not literal personalization at first, but more kind of the long tail of content. So here's like a segment of people that before it wouldn't make sense to make content just for them. Um, how do you start to do that now that it's much cheaper to create content?
Mhm.
And I think one of the biggest challenges there, and in general with LLMs, is this kind of like a mirage of like we're almost at 100%, right? It almost can do the whole thing by itself, and then what you can find is that pretty consistently you can, if the LLM can do it at all, you can get to like 80-90% like pretty quickly. Like, right, you're not going to get like 30%. Like if it can do it at all, like you can get it to 80-90%. But then the last 10% is really difficult to get. And we kind of saw this with self-driving cars, where they kind of got really, really good, really, really fast, and it's like, okay, next year it's full self-driving, next year, and it's like still not here. Obviously, if progress is continuing to be made, maybe it will be here in 5 years. um, but that's something I'm thinking about in terms of plain, if you're trying to actually compete on articles, right? Like somebody wants to read your article for real, rather than something else, then I think that this human augmentation is really the most uh, interesting
Mm.
place, where you can maybe take that podcast episode and not literally put a blog post up, but you can do 90% of the work. And then if this is interesting enough, a human comes in the loop and like finishes it up basically, for consumption. So that's something that could be very interesting.
Yeah, I mean that's perfect. I was kind of disappointed when I ran my summarization of these podcast experiments because yeah, like it what it'll do is it'll like especially that sequential summarization chain, it'll collapse the topics into lists because it like doesn't really understand what I'm talking about with Weaviate. And like maybe just like as if anyone's interested in like what I'm working on out right now, I've gotten really into the LLM fine tuning thing, and particularly we're building this model called Gorilla, but like I'm starting to learn more about it. Sam Stilling has helped me a ton with sub strategies like Weaviate listeners who are curious about. Anyways, but like I agree really strongly with this. Like I think we need to fine tune the LLMs to get that 90% to 100. Like for I don't think just the GPT-4 API. Well, I don't know though. It's so interesting. I hear so many perspectives on this, and it's like this has been. I always this topic comes up on every single Weaviate podcast.
Right.
Is whether you need to fine tune models, or especially now as retrieval augmented generation is emerging. Like when as I talk about like sometimes my frustration with these summarizations of podcasts is that it'll just like collapse the thing into a
What do you mean
list.
by collapse?
So it'll have like multiple topics. Like it'll be like, Connor and Alexa first discovered talked about this. They described this thing like, and so it captures the keyword, and then it has some sentence that summarizes the topic that makes some sense. And then like on the next step, it just boom collapse all that into just a comment separated list and the last topic. Sorry if that wasn't too clear, but
Wait, so
anyway.
comment list. So basically, you're asking it to go from the transcript to a text array, like a comma separated array of.
So I'm trying to capture like the summary. Like my goal kind of was like, can I automate the task of publishing a podcast, of which I always like write a description and then I cut up the
Yep.
chapters. And as it was writing the description, it would, it would just collapse because it goes, you will receive the clips one at a time as well as the summary so far, and then you inject the summary so far, and then and then you loop through each of the clips. And so the summary so far will be like, they discuss this topic, then they discuss this topic, and with a description of the topics, and then it will just boom comma separated list of just the keywords that describe the topic. But anyways, I think I'm getting a little distracted from our main conversation topics, but basically my conclusion is like I'm very curious about what fine tuning LLMs are going to look like, even though I'm still on the fence. Like I am working on this, but I think like it also could be the case that just retrieval augmented generation could retrieve more background on each of the keywords and avoid the collapse that way. So I don't know what the what the conclusion is going to be, but it's a lot of fun exploring it. But let me kind of come back into one of the things we were just talking about, which is this social component to podcasting. I think it's very interesting. Like as an example, I really like Ben Lorica's Data Exchange podcast, and I think one thing that would be interesting is like we there every now and then we have the same guests. Like he talked to Jerry Liu. I also had Jerry Liu on this podcast, and it's like I would be very interested in like what did Ben ask Jerry that I didn't, or if I imagine you could compare any two podcasts like this. It's maybe more interesting for me personally because like I was in the podcast, but like that kind of like comparison of podcasts and maybe share a guest and it's like what did they uniquely talk about. That's kind of where I see the social angle going.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. I mean, what's interesting now is that although honestly, I would also have to talk about the fine tuning versus RAG. Like I think that's super fascinating. But on the topic of what you just brought up, it's kind of interesting. You see this pattern in podcasting where a guest would go on a different podcast, and sometimes you get totally different things.
Mm.
But sometimes they kind of say the same thing on five different podcasts,
Oh
uh,
yeah.
and they kind of have to because unless you subscribe to that podcast, you won't hear this episode, even though it's about the same. It's roughly the same content. So I think it would be interesting, if we kind of take for granted that it doesn't matter necessarily where you said something, because the right content gets to the right person at the right time, then I think these things will naturally evolve to be more distinct every time. So like he's like, okay, I already talked about this. People who care about this,
Mm.
they already saw this. Now let's talk about something else.
Mhm.
And obviously, there's value to kind of repeating the same conversation sometimes, but that can be up to the person. They don't kind of have to do this to get their message out to some extent.
Hmm. Yeah, it makes me think about like I guess just the future of social media generally. Like if I, just like looked up Bob Van Light and I just saw like a summary of what he's been talking about for the last week on, Twitter, Hacker News, LinkedIn, maybe even like I think because there's also this interesting kind of interception between like your internal company meetings, like, and maybe I'm going off topic, but like it's kind of this whole all this like podcasting stuff. I think it's just extremely related to just recording your team meetings within your company. Like I'd imagine like that there's so much value to be extracted by just getting more of capturing the information shared in these kind of meetings. But yeah, it's all really interesting. I maybe wanted to pitch an idea to you, which was like, one of these machine learning conferences, ICLR, they developed something called OpenReview, where they open source the reviews for papers. And I
Mhm.
was, and I'm, and Twitter has like community notes now. Twitter X is called X now. I'm not. This is gonna take me a while to remember to say that, but
I still call Facebook. I can't do the meta thing. So yeah,
oh,
it'll
I
take a
actually
while.
have started calling him. I think because like the Llama 2 models, the image, like because now it's so much. I'm seeing all these exciting things, and it's like meta and.
It's
But anyway.
clicking more for me too. It's starting to finally.
Yeah, but so I was curious about what like an open review community notes for podcasts might look like, where like maybe the platform shows the transcription and like you like because sometimes I say things on the podcast and then later I'm like, I actually don't really think of it that way, like because
Community note your podcast basically. It's like, oh, this is not quite right. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, and like people
or
could
small
kind of
context.
yeah.
Yeah. That's a really interesting thing. I think this like in an ideal world, like you should have always, while you're listening, like be able to open your podcast app and kind of see, okay, where can I go from here? So kind of like a combination of
Mm,
community note, but also, okay, this, you heard something, this sounds really interesting. What are, clips related to this topic that you're right now listening to, from other podcasts potentially.
mhm,
And obviously with LLMs, you can combine this with like different perspectives, like, and this starts to apply more and more if you get to like political topics, right? Because like somebody's talking, says something with this, you can say at that moment, oh, that's an interesting argument. Like, did somebody respond to this argument on some other podcast? I think that could be very, very interesting. And and obviously, when you start talking about clips, then um, you don't even have to interrupt anything. You can kind of let people, if you display a clip, you can display the counter clip at the same time. You can display like
mm.
related tweets about it. I mean, yeah, I think there's a lot of potential there. And I'm a big fan of like open review. I think that, in academia, the existing peer review system adds a complete unreasonable amount of friction. And you can see what happens, with tweets, the community, like where seats, I don't know what we call them now. Uh, like it
Yeah.
actually works, right? Like this,
Mhm.
like people, like you get really useful context. And if we can do this, like we should do this everywhere rather than add friction. You could either block the tweet until it got community reviewed, or you can
Mhm.
let everything go and put allow context to surface up, uh, with intelligence, kind of as objectively as possible.
Hmm.
Um,
Yeah, I love that. That like yeah, like they used to call it like misinformation detection, and then there's all like there could be bias, but I think yeah, that kind of like here's one perspective, here's the counter perspective. It reminds me like well, it kind of coming back to thinking about podcasting, it reminds me of there's this language modeling decoding algorithm called Tree of Thoughts, where Tree of Thoughts is like you sample all sorts of continue like because language models are stochastic models, and so they could sample many different generations. And so, say I sample 10, and then I keep expanding the tree with 10 from 10, and so like there's so many directions the podcast could go in. And I think the other thing that's really brilliant about that idea with podcasting is like you alternate the language models that continue the tree, and they impersonate Connor, impersonate Atai by like either being, and this is comes back to our fine tuning versus RAG thing, by either being the fine tuned Connor LLM or being the RAG Connor LLM that's hooked up to like because I think I prefer the RAG thing as being the direction future for the future because I think it's going to be easier. I don't know. It's a really tricky thing because it's getting really cheap to fine tune language models with sparse fine tuning and all that stuff. So, but maybe right now it's definitely easier to just curate the corpus of information and things I've said to then impersonate me with a RAG to the chat to the like GPT-4 API.
Yeah.
But yeah, I do think that like how many different ways could we have continued our conversation we're having right now, right? Like I feel like maybe like in a meta breaking like the fourth
Yeah, it's
wall.
like everything everywhere all at once. Like, what's the other versions of this conversation? Like,
Yeah, and then having all those transcriptions. And then it will okay, so this is kind of another idea I had written down that I wanted to pitch to you is I had Yusheng Wu on the podcast who's building something called ChatArena. And so ChatArena is like where you simulate conversations between people
yeah,
impersonating
yeah,
other
yeah,
people.
yeah. I saw that.
So
Was that the Stanford or was it something else?
I think UCL. Yeah, sorry, and this would be another benefit of the community notes is you can always correct because it's sorry, I'm getting off topic, but this idea of like you simulate all these conversations and then you look for new ideas in the simulated conversation like
Oh, huh, I
that.
didn't see that one. That's interesting. Um,
It's kind of like I've gotten a ton of new ideas from talking to you now, and but it's like well yeah, it's like could an LLM because these like how you explained to me like a lot of these topics just comes from your real experience. I don't know if an LLM impersonating you would be able to react to come up with these new things, but yeah, there's like a lot of debate I think about like whether synthetic data can discover new knowledge broadly kind of.
yeah,
And
no, it's super interesting. I think it's. I mean, it all kind of connects also the fine tuning versus RAG because I think we're all still learning. It sounds like a cliche, but it's true that we're all still learning. There's this new tool in the world, and we don't really know what it's good at and what it's not. And you can really see that clearly if you look at any blog posts about like GPT-3 when it came out, like 2 years ago or
hmm
maybe a little longer at this point. Like
hmm
they're extremely naive from our perspective right now. Like people are like saying, "Oh, what does it mean that it can like autocomplete the story like that, but not like that?" Like, and then
hmm
like what we are discovering over time is no, there's these types of things it's good at, these types of things it's bad at. These are, you know, uh, RLHF. Like here's a technique, a pretty simple technique with like 1% extra compute. All of a sudden, this thing is much more capable at this thing, and I think we will find what I think there's almost certainly room for fine-tuning. I find it really hard to believe that like in 2 years we're like, oh, forget fine-tuning, just do RAG. Maybe, I don't know, but I
hmm
find it a little bit hard to believe with existing technology because it's just so much it's so effective at especially kind of selecting pre-existing capabilities from the base model, because otherwise all you have to talk all you have to available to explain to the language model what you want is inside of the context window, and that only gives you so much opportunity. And practically it's often just way too verbose. People do like few shot learning. If you're trying to get a JSON out of a language model, like you might give it 5 examples, 10 examples. Like you're not going to give it 5,000 examples in your context windows. um and
hmm
but with fine tuning you can do that. And I mean that's what when OpenAI added function calling, like that's people try to solve that problem with chains for a
hmm
month, and you can get to some places like there's a bunch of there's like the guardrails project, there's JSON
hmm
former, but the fine tuning really picks this up. And on the other hand, if you just care about plain facts, then yeah, probably it seems like that's a place where RAG is
hmm
uh, more helpful than fine tuning new facts into the model. Um, but so I'm forgetting like how there was like the point here would be another good point to have
Yeah.
that language model test.
Yeah, no, I got a ton out of that. I mean, I think, yeah, I can't reveal who said this yet, but a recent Weaviate podcast separated it between if you want to teach the language model a new skill versus then fine tune versus knowledge, then RAG is one perspective of thinking about it, like learn a skill versus learn knowledge. Like a lawyer, has the knowledge of like here's the law says, and then they have the skill of how to craft the argument from the law is kind of and I can kind of relate to that thing. And I guess kind of, yeah, you mentioned the long context thing. I mean, and then there's kind of the idea of also like, well, instead of investing the energy in fine tuning the language model, maybe you fine tune the embedding model or just tweak your search systems with like the ranking tuning. And maybe there's just more to that to giving it the perfect context. But kind of like something, and I hope I'm not about to get us off topic too much, but like this kind of thing of, you mentioned like GPT-3 to GPT-4. I mean, what a phase shift, right? Like GPT-3, you had to like, few shot prompt it to do a task badly. I mean, like, I hope it's not
Yeah.
too opinionated, but like, come on, And so now it's like talking to you fluently, and it's like blown the world's mind. Like everyone you talk to, if you talk to them about ChatGPT, they're like, they get it, and it's crazy. Whereas I don't think people really reacted to that with GPT-3, but I think kind of like, to me, it's like this idea of like experience grounds language, or on meaning and understanding, climbing towards NLU, paper from Emily Bender. I forget the title, but like the language models that are doing RLHF to like do customer support. Like we had this thing, Kappa AI, in our Slack, and it was, it answers your questions about Weaviate. And I imagine having a conversation with that language model could maybe be interesting, because you're like, what are you learning? Like you answered 5,000 questions. Like, what are people asking? What are you learning? And maybe there's something to that. I'm not sure.
So that's where we got actually before, right? Like the creativity part. So I actually, in my
Yeah.
personal life, forget like product development. Like I've had many interactions with a language model that felt like it evoked creativity, right? Like it
Mm,
like you bounce ideas. I mean, even rubber ducking can be helpful, but this was not a rubber duck, right? Like it actually gave its own creativity. Now, I, I think probably it got. I don't think it made things up. It only got at them from pre-existing things that are related. But I am
mm,
not aware of these things that are out there. And B, like one of the big advantages of language models is they don't get psychologically stuck. I guess they can, right? You can get this loop, but every run is a fresh run.
mm,
And So that can help you get out of some. You might see a problem in this kind of very laser focused blindfolds way, and the language model can kind of open up a new direction that you would have gone to eventually, but it will take you a while. So yeah, I think there's definitely opportunity to actually make these things interesting, and especially the more intelligent models.
mm-hmm.
Yeah, like you said, GPT-4 versus GPT-3 is a big jump. Um,
Yeah, absolutely. I think that some people, it's only interpolating, but it's like, okay, but it's interpolating between a super high dimensional space. And it's like the interpolations in this space is still going to be really interesting. Yeah, like measure, I love that topic of like, how do you measure generalization broadly, but yeah, awesome. Atai, I think this has been an incredible coverage of topics. And so I
yeah,
hope, kind of wrapping this up, I think we did explore so many topics, but is there maybe anything you'd want to conclude with, kind of on like how you see the future of podcasting? I mean, I know we talked about a lot of potential
yeah,
things, but like kind of maybe one thing that maybe you even had, like maybe before we started talking, already kind of like what you're convinced of.
yeah. So I mean, I think podcasting and generally audio video. Like I said, like talking, we're building this audio video database with
Mm,
podcasting as the first internal kind of design partner of this product. And I think what's obvious is if you look 3 years down the line, one way or another, audio video are going to become as searchable as text, where you can search and analyzable, right? So you can now do analysis at the level of semantics.
mm,
Like podcast is one application of this. Call centers, I think that we brought this up at another point. That's another big application. And right now you have to build all this custom code to answer pretty general questions, like where are there calls where the customer got angry and in the end actually got resolved well. And in legal analysis, people like do legal analysis over audio and video. So this is, I think, what's really interesting is the trend of taking these unstructured, speech and video later too. When you look at actual pixels on the screen and um, make them as analyzable as we're used to with text. So I think that's going to be very interesting. And because there's so much knowledge and high quality knowledge locked away in these formats, I think that will have a big impact.
yeah, I really turned into the exploding head emoji, because the like this post game analysis. I had a conversation with my brother in law this weekend, who does stand up comedy,
Oh yeah.
And we were talking about like stand-up comedy versus like giving an academic lecture and kind of like the way the crowd reacts to it. And it just makes me think like, after you do comedy or a comedy podcast, maybe you'd be like, how did I do? How many laughs did I get? And that kind of visual information. But I think it's also very interesting for like the academic thing because it's not as obvious. Like, if you laugh, like you laugh and it can probably easily detect that. Whereas like if you pitch like an idea and the guest like likes it or you like, like you're like, oh, like and it's like more of a subtle thing. And I think that kind of like post game analysis of like, how did I do in the podcast? Like, was I interesting? And I think there probably is a lot of like audio visual like information that you would not get out of just the text transcript, right? But right now, I'm personally very biased towards the text.
No,
I'm only
that's where we're starting out. Like right now, we're not really looking at visual stuff at all. That most of the information is, I think, in the text.
yeah, but I mean, certainly that audio video. There's going to be breakthroughs in deep learning in that.
Yeah,
Is a really
absolutely.
cool space to be in. Atai, thank you so much for joining the Weaviate podcast. This was such an engaging conversation for me. I learned so much to open my eyes about this. Yep.
Thank you very much for having me. It was really fun.